Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome out to Movement. If we haven't had the chance to meet yet, my name is Josh, newer here around Movement and a newer face on the stage. Excited to be in the series that we're talking through this morning. We've been going through this series called Launch Team. And so Launch Team is kind of this idea of when a new church starts, they need people to go and really carry the same DNA, be unified in that, and have the same shared values. And while Movement isn't a new church, it is moving into a new building this fall. And so there's kind of this vibe we're feeling of relaunching as we enter into that space. And what is some of the value and visions, what have been those priorities since Movement began 10 years ago? And what do we want to prioritize as we move into that new building? And so we've talked about serving, we've talked about community, we've talked about sharing the hope of Jesus with others, we've talked about generosity. And so today, what we're going to unpack, kind of the last part of this series, is church planning. And so Movement Church was a church plant. About 10-ish years ago, Mark and Kristen Artrip moved from Powell to Hilliard and started Movement. And wouldn't you know, 5 years after that, that DNA of church planning was still a priority, and they called Joel and Morgan Trainer and sent them to Gehanna to plant Three Creeks Church. And then a few years after that, Trey and Sarah Gilmore, they were sent to Grandview. And so there's been this replicating, reproducing church planning DNA that has always been a part of Movement. And the reason I'm up on stage this morning is because me, my wife Sarah, and our three kids, we have recently moved to the area because we get to be the fourth church plant in that process. And we are relocating to Sunbury, Ohio. And we're not relocating there just because it's nice to live. That's actually where we're going to be planning the church. And so we're excited to be a part of this next year. You're allowed to be excited about that too for us, or you can just think we're crazy. And we're in the process of that right now. So if you don't know what that looks like or you're unfamiliar with it, specifically for our family, we're in the process of relocating to that area. We moved here a couple months ago. We are on staff here at Movement. So this is our church family. So when I talk about like we're moving into a building, like this is our church family for this next year. This is where we're being sent out of. And what we'll be doing is we'll be kind of preparing to start that church as we relocate. We had to raise support for us to be here this year. And so 70 different individuals and families have gotten behind us financially, even more who are praying for us, and we're spending this next year dedicating kind of our time to being trained and preparing and moving to that area. So our house is going to be done in just a couple weeks. We are so excited to move in and to not be around the 7 cats that we're with right now. Super grateful to have a place to stay, but there's a lot of cats. And we're going to be moving into our new house. This fall, we'll unpack a little bit more for you what the vision is going to be behind this church plant, talk a little bit about the area, about our vision and kind of our hearts behind that. And so we'll talk in more detail this fall. You should at least just know it's in Sunbury. It's going to be in Sunbury. And then in the spring of next year, we'll start to have some interest meetings and kind of begin to form a launch team for a new church. And so that'll be an open conversation. If we want to dialogue more about that, grab lunch, come to some of those meetings. And once we form our launch team, Movement will commission us next summer, and we will begin that new church plant. So can't believe that it's actually happening. Like there's still so many unknowns. But hey, here we are, and that's why we want to keep this DNA at the front of who Movement is and like who we are as kind of a network of churches. And so many of you maybe know those stories of the Gilmores and the Trainers and the Artrips better than I do. Maybe you were a part of that process. Maybe you were on one of those launch teams, or you sent friends to go plant those churches. And so you kind of have watched others journey through that. Maybe you wanted to be part of a launch team, but it just like wasn't the right time or the right season or the right area. Maybe you're here and you're like, I don't understand why anyone would relocate their lives for a church. That is bizarre. And you are not wrong. And you should also know that church planning is not in the DNA of every church. You can go to a great church and they may not value church planning the same way that another church does, especially that Movement does. Church planting is not necessarily baked into the cake for being a church. I think that what happens in many churches is they kind of default to the place where kind of we all default to as human beings, no matter how we view our lives. What we end up doing is just by default, we end up operating just out of our own self-interest most of the time. Like our worlds are mostly consumed around what directly affects us, for better, for worse. Not that we're against anyone, we're just like very for ourselves, right? Because it's our life, it's our world. And so we see the world just through our own perspective. And what ends up happening in the church is that also that view of we're the only ones who exist, that narrow focus begins to set in just by default. Not that you're even against other churches, but you only see what's right in front of you. And so it's challenging to see beyond that for us as people or for us as a church, to see beyond just self-interest, to not just consider our own needs and problems, the things that directly affect or benefit us, to be a church that gives away people and money and energy and vision for other churches that are new, that are going to go beyond where they are at. And I think that at the heart of that problem is we often operate for our own benefit. Many outside the church are seeing this too. I started meeting with a guy named Tommy last year. Tommy was moving back to the area. He was in his upper 20s and he had just gone through a pretty bad breakup after a long-term relationship. And so he was relocating to the area. His relationships were changing. His life was changing. And in that process, Tommy got connected with a church group from our church. And Tommy would have been a self-ascribed agnostic. He believed there was God, but he didn't really know if he could know God. And so a lot of Tommy's kind of like searching in life was trying to see how he could be a generous and kind and loving person, but he had no idea how God fit into that. And maybe just wondered, could I just pursue those things instead of pursuing God altogether? But he had this longing and he had this interest and he found himself in this church group. And I met Tommy when he came back to church for the first time. He walked into our building and I was our group's pastor, and their leader introduced him to me and I got to know him a little bit, and he wanted to meet with me. He wanted to grab coffee. He had some questions to kind of navigate life and faith right now. And so we got together, and I'll never forget the first time I sat down with him, just kind of the conversation. I'm like, tell me your story, where are you kind of at with the church and with Jesus? And Tommy told me, he said, I grew up in the Catholic Church, but I left after high school. He says, the main reason I left was because I noticed so much condemnation in the church for people outside the church. And he said that he's really struggled with that. That it seemed like all the church cared about was themselves and what they believed and what benefited them. And he told me, he said, honestly, I got nervous when I found out the group I was a part of was connected to a church. He said, because I knew you'd be benefiting from it in some way. And I kind of laughed because I was like, dude, I don't get like commission for you being in one of the groups at the church. Maybe I wish I did, I don't know. But he was like, had this jaded sense of like, I know everyone's just looking out for themselves. People always operate out of their self-interest. And you want to know who's at the top of that list? Our churches. Churches operate out of self-interest. Christians do that. And friends, that is absolutely backwards to who we are called to be. And so what we're going to unpack today, kind of the big idea, is that sending is greater than self-interest. We're going to unpack that and really push back on it and see why that's been a value here at Movement, because it has shown itself in so many ways that we believe sending is better than our own self-interest. Again, this is going to be the fourth time a church plant is happening in this network. There have been hundreds of thousands of dollars that have been sent outside of this church. Over 20% of the people through Movement have been given away. And it's hard to see all that's happening, but if you could have had a flyover of all the church plants that were having Easter services this past Easter, there were 970 people a part of those churches. And so it's easy to miss all that's going on. And even if you haven't gone to be part of a church plant, you are part of church planting, because if you give to Movement, that's what those resources are being used for. If you're in a Movement group, if you're in community and you're raising up leaders or you're sharing life with people who get sent out, that is a part of church planting. If you pray for your church, or if you pray for our family or for those church planners, you are a part of church planning. And so when we talk about sending today, we're talking in a very broad category that actually all of us are a part of in one way or another, even if we don't physically relocate. Here's what J.D. Greear said in his book, Gaining by Losing. I think this is phenomenal. He says, every church, every ministry, and every follower of Jesus ought to be devoted to planting, giving away what they have for God's kingdom. He says churches and pastors are not free to build ministries that mainly make life more comfortable for us. Each of us is under obligation to do whatever we can to get the gospel to those all around the world who've never heard. And that means releasing, planting the seeds we've been given. It means letting go and sending out our very best to bring a harvest in God's kingdom, especially even when it doesn't benefit our church directly. He says, what we achieve by building our personal platform will never be as great as what God achieves through what we give away in faith. I love those statements he made, and I want to kind of reduce some of those down to a few statements for us to walk out of here with today, because what he's saying isn't just great for him to come up with, it's profoundly centered around who Jesus was and what we see when we read the Bible and how people follow Jesus. And so we're going to unpack kind of three powerful statements today that I think help us begin to see why sending is greater than self-interest. Here's the first one. It's that sending is a calling for every church and follower of Jesus. It's what he started off by saying, that every ministry, every follower of Christ, every church should be devoted to planting, to sending. Actually, Jesus's early followers, they called them disciples, which just meant that they were students of Jesus. They were apprentices. They learned his way of life and they wanted to model their lives after his life and teaching. And a few of the disciples who were leading that early movement, they called them apostles. And more than that being like a fancy title, it was an identity statement for who they were, because the word apostle means sent one. And the apostles were sent by Jesus, commissioned by Jesus to go replicate the life and ministry of Jesus. He made it very clear that those who followed him would be sent. Take a look at this in Matthew 28. You can grab a Bible under the chairs that you're sitting on, or you can open up your phone and it'll also be on the screen. But we're going to read through this. At the end of Jesus's life and ministry, he says this. It says that Jesus came and told his disciples, "I've been given all authority in heaven and on earth. Therefore, go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I've given you. And be sure this, I am always with you, even to the end of the age." For those familiar with church in the Bible, we call this the Great Commission, a very well-known part of the Bible because it's kind of Jesus's last words. If you're wondering, what did Jesus expect his followers to do when he was gone? He puts it into words right here. He expects them to go based upon the authority that Jesus has in heaven and on earth and make disciples across all the world, in all nations, to teach them, to baptize them, to bring them into the family of God. In another account of Jesus' life in the Gospel of John, Jesus says, "As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." Jesus knew that the pattern of those who followed him would be sending. And we don't have time to unpack all these verses, but there's no escaping that someone who says yes to following Jesus is supposed to understand themselves as now being a recruit who would replicate themselves all across the world, in their neighborhood, in their city, and to the ends of the earth. That is what Jesus wanted them to understand their identity as, was sent ones. Now the question is, or at least what we have to wrestle through, is if we call ourselves a follower of Jesus, a disciple, a modern day follower of his, do we embrace the calling and the identity of being sent? I feel like what most of us wrestle through is a sense of hearing what Jesus is saying, but really believing it's probably for someone else. And maybe we'll even like adopt the title of like, okay, I guess I'm sent by Jesus. But what we feel a little bit is a sense of imposter syndrome. You know what I'm talking about? Psychology today defines imposter syndrome as people who struggle with the belief that they are undeserving of their achievements and or status. They feel that they aren't as competent as others might think, and that soon enough, people will discover the truth about them. See, Jesus gives each of his disciples and us today as his followers the same commissioning. You're sent. And it's on my authority, it's in my name that I'm sending you out. Go and make disciples. But what I think every single one of us wrestles with a little bit is that imposter syndrome, that it shouldn't be us. Certainly, there has to be someone who's far more qualified, someone on a stage, someone who has like a Bible degree, someone who's like the leader of a group or something, someone who's like a sage in the faith. There's got to be someone who, maybe an extroverted Christian, I don't know, like they're the ones who should be sent, but not me. And when we say we're all sent, we feel a sense of like, oh man, I want to be that, I know I should be that, but if people found out who I really was, that's not me. I couldn't be that. We're afraid that we're going to be discouraged that people are going to see that we're not really who people think we are. We're not living up to who Jesus called us to be. It's hard for us to hear Jesus' words to his disciples as applicable to us today. That Jesus, when he said, go and make disciples, or as I've been sent, I'm sending you, he's speaking to us the same way he spoke to his first followers. It's difficult because maybe we're waiting for the time it'll actually click, some kind of initiation or some moment where it finally all comes together and we feel like we're worthy to be sent by Jesus. We're actually living out the part. But Jesus doesn't send out the disciples because they're worthy. It says because of the authority that he has in heaven and on earth, and that he will be with them always. So us being sent has nothing to do with our qualifications or our extrovertedness or even how we feel about ourselves. It's that Jesus has already commissioned us. We're not sent based upon our qualifications, but his. We don't have to wait for some kind of secondary and like initiation ceremony, some kind of secret talk that we're going to get from someone that finally shows that we've arrived. One of those apostles trying to help the early followers of Jesus understand this reality wrote this in 2 Corinthians 5. He said, anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person. The old life is gone. The new life has begun. This is all a gift from God. A gift isn't something you earn, it's something you receive. It's a gift from God who brought us back to himself through Jesus. And God has given us the task of reconciling people to him. And he says, this is who we are now. We are Christ's ambassadors. We represent him. God is making his appeal through us. We speak for Jesus when we plead, come back to God. The same thing that Jesus did. It said that Jesus came to seek and to save the lost, people who were far from God. And he says, actually, no, there's a way for you to be near. He says, you get to represent that same mission, that same message, that same ministry. You are now the ones helping reconcile people back to God. That's who you are. You're not the old self, you're the new self. And that's not because you got your life together. That's because Jesus gave you a gift. It's his authority. He's with you. And there's no other invitation or validation apart from receiving what Jesus has already done for you. So that's the first thing, is that sending is the calling of every church and every follower of Jesus. Here's the second one. It's that self-interest is the great enemy of sending. Self-interest is the great enemy of sending. J.D. Greear said, as we read, churches and pastors are not free to build ministries that mainly make life more comfortable for us. This is incredibly challenging, as we talked about, because we acknowledge that self-interest is the default for most of us. It's not even that we're against anyone else, it's just that we most naturally think about ourselves first. We think about how to make life more comfortable for us. We think about what benefits us directly. We often struggle with wanting to keep the best for ourselves. And just in case you feel like this isn't you, like somehow we get exempt from this because you come to Movement Church, or for me to feel that way because I'm on stage or I serve here and I'm giving my life away. A question I often wrestle through is, what am I not willing to give up? The quickest way to expose my true self-interest is when I think about the things that I hold on to the most tightly. And for me, often what I try to hold on to most are relationships and our people. Maybe you are in a movement group here, or maybe you're thinking about being one this fall. I had the opportunity at the church I was at in Akron to be the group's pastor there. And so I got to work with lots of leaders having groups in their home. We led a group for 5 years. And so we were very acquainted with like what it was like to share life with people and kind of the mess of that, but also the fun of it. Because community can be either like the most life-giving thing ever, or it can just drain you a ton. And it's kind of a toss-up. Like you don't really know. Like we can talk about how great it is to be in community, and you're like taking a ton of risk by showing up and what it's gonna actually be like. Or if you're leading a group, you don't always get to pick who shows up. I mean, sometimes you get people who come to your group and their jokes are horrible, right? And their snacks are even worse. And you're like, I can't believe like God brought this awkward person to my house and now they're gonna be here every week for the rest of the year. And it's like this terrible thing that you don't know how, you're like wanna love them, but you're like, I don't know if they fit. How do I tell them they don't fit? And it's like, is it with a note? Is it with a text? Like, how do you let them know they should probably look for other groups? And it can just be this challenging thing. And when you arrive at a version of community or a group where you feel like you can be safe, you can be vulnerable, it clicks, you understand each other's stories, you're like, oh, this is what all the risk was worth. It was worth taking all that risk. And then all of a sudden, your group's full. Or God keeps bringing more people to this good thing that you have. But the only way to make room for them is to multiply it. And I remember that was really easy to say as a pastor of our group's ministry, but it was a really difficult thing to live out in our own group. There were times where we had to send the people who were like our people, the ones who we felt like why we could have people in our house again on a Thursday night. We had to send some of those friends away because one of them went to go be with a church plant, and another one finished his medical residency and went to go be a surgeon in Indiana. And so we sent them out because God was using them in different ways. I remember when we had our first kind of apprentices, our support leaders, they were doing great at like learning how to lead and build relationships with people and serve others. And they started like doing better at leading group than us. So we sent them out to start their own group. And I remember the first week after we had like this bonfire and we prayed over them and the new leaders were gonna start the next week and they took half of the group with them. We showed up back at our house the next week and everyone was like kind of depressed. They were like, all of our friends are gone. And worse than that, like we had invited like a bunch of new people to check out our group and they were like, can we please belong? And everyone was like, no, like we don't ever want to have friends ever again. They just leave. And it was just like this really hard thing to navigate relationally. And I was like, how do we do this? How do you help a bunch of biological kids feel like they can hang out with the adopted kids in their one family? And it was hard to want to see the good fruit of multiplying because we had gone through so much loss. And that's a little bit of why self-interest kind of becomes the default again, especially after you've had to go through giving so much away. We don't want to go through that loss again. We remember how hard it can be. It's a lot of work to start over. But then there's that reality. The reality that this is something we've experienced. It was something that someone allowed for us to have. And we have to be faced with how do we actually work through that default self-interest we have and get to the place where we want to send. I think the only way that will change for us personally or for a whole group of people is to interact more with Jesus. Because Jesus was the least self-interested person who ever walked this planet. Jesus said that he came not to be served, but to serve others and give his life as a ransom for many. He came to give his life away. Reflecting on his life, Paul, one of the apostles who we read earlier, wrote this. He said, "Don't look out only for your own interests, but take an interest in others too. You must have the same attitude that Jesus had. Even though he was God, he did not think equality with God was something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges, and he took the humble position of a servant and was born as a human. And when he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on a cross." See, what happens is when you interact with Jesus, you realize how self-giving he is. It's crazy to be around him because it just always outshines how self-interested we are and how he was that toward you. When it says he came to serve others and give his life as a ransom, he came to serve you personally and to give his life for you personally. And that should affect how we operate in our own self-interest. We should be willing to give up in order to prioritize the interest of others. See, I think many people today have still yet to learn that at the center of Jesus' teaching was a call to die to yourself. He said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross and follow me. If you want to save your life, you'll lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it." See, that's what's so backwards about the way of Jesus, is it requires an emptying of self-interest, and Jesus was the first to walk that path. He leads the way. He leads the way in emptying himself. He leads the way in a life that is sent and given away. So I think a litmus test for if we're self-giving or if we're self-interested is to ask the question, can I hold the relationships that I have with an open hand while still fully investing myself in people? Can I do both of those things? Can I hold the relationships I have with an open hand, but can I also fully invest myself in people knowing that their lives are going to move them and things are going to change in that relationship? Someone who is self-giving is able to do that, to work toward that. And so if you're in a movement group, and maybe it's looking pretty good this year, you're dialed in, there's deep relationships. The most challenging thing you might have to do this year is begin to look at Jesus and remember, all right, we're supposed to give this away. It's really challenging to do. To be willing to multiply because you know you need to make room for others who need this good community, these relationships as well. But the only thing that changes that is encountering how self-giving and non-self-interested Jesus was to you. And when that happens, it changes us. It changes how we see other people. They're not competition, they're not annoying, they're not in the way. We start to develop a heart for people who are displaced, for people who are lost, for people who are unreached. We were reading here in 2 Corinthians 5, let's continue. It says, "He died for everyone," Jesus did, "so that those who receive his new life would no longer live for themselves. Instead, they will live for Jesus, who died and was raised for them." He says, so we've stopped evaluating others from a human point of view. At one time, we thought of Christ merely from a human point of view. It says, but how differently we know him now. It changes us and it changes how we see other people. Because once you have been lost and displaced and broken and rejected, and you have experienced that reality to feel unwanted, to feel pushed aside, and then Jesus enters in and he finds you and he accepts you and he restores you, and he brings you in, you see the world totally differently. This is what will motivate us to displace ourselves again, to relocate, to give away, is because we know what it's like to be in the position of the lost and the displaced. That was once us. When I was in Akron, the first few years I was there, I would help with this group called World Relief, and they would resettle refugees from across the world. We mainly would get people who are from Nepal or Burma or Syria, and we would kind of help them get life running in the States. And so we would take them to appointments. We would get them into their first home. We would help translate things, even though I didn't know any of their language. Google Translate was like very important in that time as I'm trying to like read a bill for them or translate with the people at the Social Security office. And there was just such a deep displacement that it was hard for me to wrap my mind around, that they had to leave their home, their country, to go somewhere that completely was different. Eva Hoffman was a refugee during the Holocaust. She was a Jew from Poland. And she wrote this in an essay. She said, "Since the beginning of time, is there anyone who does not feel like an exile?" He says, "Those of us who have been estranged from our literal physical home very often get this deep nostalgia that if I could just get back there, the emptiness and dissatisfaction I am feeling would be healed. But if we actually get back there, we discover we are not completely satisfied with it. Physical homelessness actually signifies something deeper, that we are ejected from our authentic self, an ideal sense of belonging, a tuning with others and ourselves that eludes us." See, what this refugee identified was physical homelessness, being displaced physically, actually just points to a deeper spiritual and emotional thing that goes on in pretty much all of us, where we feel like we're not okay, we're not home, we can't be ourselves. We got to find a way to make sure that we're presentable to others, that like we fit in, that we can belong, that we have a place. And we wrestle through the emotional insecurity of feeling displaced. That is a huge part of developing a heart for those who we need to go reach, is to remember what that's like for us, what it's like to feel like you don't belong, what it's like to feel rejected, and then to remember that Jesus has personally entered into your story and life to change the script. It motivates us to do that for others. And when we don't, it greatly affects our ability to be self-sacrificial for the lost. No one understands self-sacrifice more than God himself. Maybe you know John 3:16, that God so loved the world that he gave his only son. He saw the lostness and displacedness of people, and he said, I must give them my best because I love them. The third thing that I think is powerful for us to see that sending is greater than self-interest is that God accomplishes great things by what we give away in faith. The statement that J.D. Greer said, that more than building our personal platform, God accomplishes more by what we give away in faith. And that's just not a good idea. That's what Jesus believed. Like, can you imagine what it was like for those first followers, his best friends, those 12 disciples who spent 3 years with Jesus, watching him do miraculous things, who laughed with him and partied with him and traveled with him and shared meals with him. And then all of a sudden to see their friend accused of something he didn't do and crucified on a cross and then put into a tomb, realizing that their friend was gone. And then a few days later to see that their friend was alive and well. And it says that one of the first disciples who found Jesus, when they saw him, they clinged to him and held on to him because they didn't want him to leave again. And Jesus said, you have to let go of me right now. You can't cling to me because there's other things I have to go do. The hope that they would feel, okay, we can get the group back together again. It was all ruined, but now we can all be back together. It can be the way it's supposed to be. And you want to know what Jesus says? He says, it's best for you that I go away. Because if I don't, then the advocate won't come, the Holy Spirit. But if I do go away, I will send the Holy Spirit to you. See, Jesus did a math that was totally different because he was self-giving. He knew that what was more important than him setting up shop and getting a book signing deal and like getting a really big auditorium and building his own personal brand was giving each person who would follow him the power of God and the guidance of God through the Holy Spirit. And instead of having to try to fit everyone into one room, he would empower us to go out and be representatives of Jesus to those around us. He also said, I tell you the truth, anyone who believes in me will do the same works I have done and even greater works because I'm going to be with the Father. Guys, statistically, church plants reach more people than existing churches because you're relocalizing the local church. When was the last time you shared your faith with people in Gehanna or Grandview or Sunbury? We can't reach everyone, so we have to send. And sending requires faith. In Hebrews 11:6, it says it's impossible to please God without faith. It's impossible to please God without faith. Faith is not easy. It requires risk. It means stepping out. It means not knowing. You can't pretend to have faith, real faith. You can't have your foot in one place and your foot in another. You can't say you really trust that you're all in with something and not really be there. You can't be in two places at the same time. You have to take God-sized risks to see God-sized works. And sending just doesn't make sense half the time because it's so difficult, it's so backwards. Don't be surprised when this faith that God often calls us to, he uses someone to articulate that faith for you personally. I remember when we were wrestling through if we were feeling called to stay in Akron and ministry we had there, or to move to Columbus and be crazy people who followed Mark our trip. I talked with one of my friends, and I called him on the phone, and I kind of shared with him, this is what I think it's gonna look like if we go down there, and some of the things I think will be hard, and some of the things that I think will be good. Here's what it'd be like to stay, the things that I think will be hard, the things that I think will be good. And I just remember my friend saying, he said, I don't really know what you're supposed to do. He said, but either option you choose is gonna require faith. And then he asked me a question. He said, what kind of faith do you think God is asking the Taylor family to have right now? That was the wisest thing I heard in my whole process of trying to decide if we should go. What kind of faith is God asking you to have? Because he is certainly asking you to have a life of faith because it pleases him. It's impossible to please God without faith. That doesn't mean you have to move, but it means that the very nature of what it means to see God at work in your life means faith will be a part of it in some way. There's gonna be unknowns. There's gonna be risks. There's gonna be loss. You're going to be desperate for God in some ways, even if it doesn't require physical relocation. And I remember when we decided to come, and I felt like I was able to hold it together, and we packed up the 26-foot U-Haul and a little bit more, and we asked our friends who were helping us load to stay and pray with us. And I just remember being scared. Everyone who we loved was there in our driveway, and they just put all of our stuff into a van. And they were releasing us. And it was kind of my turn to pray. And I just remember saying, God, I hope this pleases you. Like, that's why we're doing it. That was why we moved there 8 years ago. We didn't know anyone. We gave up our church and our friends. God, I hope this pleases you. And we prayed and we cried and walked through the house one last time, and now we're here. Eugene Peterson, a pastor and author, he said, "The only way any of us can live at our best is in a radical life of faith in God." If you've signed up to follow Jesus, it will require faith. He will push you to the place where you begin to see giving yourself away, sending as a greater priority than our own self-interest. The only way any of us can live life at our best is in a radical life of faith in God. So here's what we're challenged with at the end of this series, this conversation is, are we growing as a person who sins? Or is our self-interest have a foothold in our life? Is it creating fear, tight-fistedness, an unwillingness to see something different? You have to believe that Jesus has called you to this. You got to be able to invest in relationships, but also be open-handed with them because you love lost people. You have to really believe that God grows his kingdom most by what you give away in faith, not by what you keep. And that's difficult. Why don't we invite the band, but pray through that here just for a minute. Father, we acknowledge how difficult this is. The life of faith, the life of giving ourselves away, God. And there's just no other way for us to be captivated by that calling other than seeing your son, Jesus. So help us to see him more clearly. That when we were far from you and we felt lost and displaced, you moved into our lives in such radical ways that we can't possibly forget or be different because of what you've done. Would you help our lives to be this beautiful giving away of ourselves in whatever way you call us to? We want to be obedient and humble to you. We want to see the mighty things that you can do for your name through our lives, but keep us open-handed, God. Help us to be willing to go where you go, to say what you ask us to say, and to be who you call us to be. And give us courage and faith. In Jesus' name, amen.